The neighborhood had always seemed like the kind of place where life moved slowly, where everyone knew everyone, and where peace was the rule rather than the exception. Tree-lined streets gave a calm feeling, and the small lake at the edge of the community shimmered quietly under the sunlight. For years, residents had enjoyed walking paths, weekend picnics, and quiet afternoons by the water. But beneath the calm surface, the homeowners association had begun to tighten its grip, enforcing every rule with a precision that some found oppressive. One resident, who had lived in the neighborhood for more than a decade, had always followed the rules without complaint. They kept the yard neat, trimmed the hedges regularly, and even helped neighbors carry groceries or fix fences when needed. Life had been peaceful and simple, just the way they liked it. They had no desire to cause conflict, but they also had a strong sense of fairness and justice. When something threatened what was rightfully theirs, they were willing to stand up, even if it meant going against a powerful organization like the HOA. It all started on a regular morning when a letter arrived in the mail. The envelope bore the HOA logo in a tone that was immediately formal and strict. The letter claimed that the parking lot near the residents' property and the small lake that touched the edge of their backyard were technically under HOA control. It demanded that they stop using the areas without approval and threatened penalties for non-compliance. The residents stared at the words, bewildered. The parking lot had been there long before the HOA even existed in its current form, and the lake had always been part of the property according to their records. How could anyone claim it was not theirs to enjoy? At first, the resident thought it might be a misunderstanding. They carefully read through the HOA's documents and rules, but nothing seemed to justify the claim. They remembered all the times they had seen families picnicking by the lake, children playing near its edge, and neighbors parking in the lot without issue. There had never been any previous warnings or restrictions. To them, the notice felt sudden, unnecessary, and aggressive. It was as if the HOA had decided overnight to assert control over parts of the community that were historically shared or privately owned. The resident tried to respond calmly. They drafted a letter, attaching copies of property deeds and maps showing the boundaries of their land. They explained the history of the parking lot and the lake, citing records from the local land registry that clearly indicated their ownership. They hoped that by presenting facts and evidence, the situation could be resolved quickly and peacefully. They even suggested a meeting with HOA representatives to discuss the issue face-to-face, but the HOA's response was dismissive. They acknowledged receipt of the residents' documents but maintained their claim, insisting that all use of the parking lot and lake required HOA approval. The letters grew more formal and threatening with each exchange, mentioning fines, possible legal action, and strict enforcement of HOA rules. The resident could feel the weight of bureaucracy pressing down, but they also knew that the facts were on their side. They were determined not to give in without a fight. Days turned into weeks, and the situation began to affect daily life. The resident noticed that neighbors had started to pay attention. Some were sympathetic, quietly offering words of encouragement, while others seemed nervous, wary of getting involved and risking the HOA's displeasure. It became clear that the association had a reputation for intimidating residents, and many people were afraid to speak up. But the resident refused to be bullied. They spent hours reviewing property maps, historical records, and even old photographs that showed the lake and parking lot as part of their property over the decades. Each morning, they walked to the edge of the lake and looked out over the water, trying to calm their mind. The lake had always been a place of comfort, a place to think, to breathe, to watch the wildlife and feel connected to nature. The thought that someone might take control of it or restrict access felt almost unbearable. It wasn't just about property. It was about preserving a sense of home and community. Every tree along the lake's edge, every ripple in the water, was part of a shared history that the HOA seemed eager to erase or control. The parking lot, too, had its own story. It was small but essential, used by residents, guests, and service vehicles alike. For years, people had parked there without question, knowing it was convenient and safe. The resident remembered helping a neighbor fix a flat tire there, and even organized a few community gatherings where everyone parked and walked down to the lake. The thought of losing unrestricted access, or being forced to jump through hoops just to use a space they had always counted on, felt wrong in a deep, fundamental way. Despite the growing tension, the resident remained calm and methodical. They made a plan to document every interaction with the HOA, noting dates, times, and details of conversations. Every letter, email, and phone call was carefully recorded. They took photographs of the property lines, the parking lot, and the lake, capturing evidence that could support their claim if the dispute escalated further. Each step was deliberate and measured, a quiet resistance against a system that seemed eager to intimidate. Neighbors began to notice the residents' determination. Some quietly expressed admiration, sharing stories of their own frustrations with the HOA but feeling powerless to challenge them. Others whispered about the growing tension, curious about who would win. The resident didn't seek attention or recognition. They were motivated by principle. It was not about proving power or winning a battle for status. It was about protecting what was rightfully theirs and ensuring fairness for themselves and others in the neighborhood. The HOA, meanwhile, seemed to misinterpret the residents' calm and methodical approach as weakness. They continued to issue warnings, fines, and increasingly aggressive letters, as if expecting compliance through intimidation. But each attempt only strengthened the residents' resolve. They knew that giving in would set a dangerous precedent, not just for themselves, but for any neighbor who might face similar challenges in the future. Evenings were spent reviewing old maps and property documents that had been collected over the years. The resident traced the lines of the parking lot, noted historical usage patterns, and cross-referenced everything with municipal records. It became clear that the evidence overwhelmingly supported their ownership. Each discovery, each confirmation of historical use, brought a small sense of satisfaction and reinforced their belief that persistence and careful preparation were the best tools in this fight. The dispute was not easy. Friends and family offered support, but also warned that the HOA could drag the matter out indefinitely. The resident understood the risks but refused to be swayed by fear. They believed in facing challenges directly, in standing up calmly for what was right. The conflict became a quiet obsession, a daily reminder that even peaceful communities could harbor struggles over power and property. Yet despite the stress, there was a sense of purpose and clarity in their actions. This was a fight worth having, not for personal gain but for justice and fairness. As the weeks passed, the resident realized that the situation was bigger than a parking lot or a lake. It was about asserting rights, protecting community spaces, and ensuring that no one could be bullied into submission. They also understood that patience would be crucial. Each interaction with the HOA needed to be thoughtful, measured, and precise. They could not afford to react emotionally or make mistakes that could weaken their position. Throughout this period, the lake remained a symbol of resilience. Walking along its edge, the resident would watch the sunlight dance on the water, listen to the quiet rustle of leaves, and feel the gentle pull of history in the air. It reminded them why they were fighting, not out of anger or spite, but to preserve a sense of home and community that had been built over decades. The parking lot, though more mundane, represented the practical side of ownership and freedom, the ability to use what was theirs without fear or restriction. The first part of the struggle set the stage for what was to come. The resident had proven that calm persistence, careful documentation, and a clear sense of principle could stand against intimidation. They had begun to gather support, understand the strength of evidence, and prepare for the challenges ahead. While the HOA might have thought they could assert control easily, the resident knew that truth, history, and persistence were on their side. The fight had only just begun, and the next steps would require patience, strategy, and a deep commitment to fairness and justice. After weeks of careful preparation and gathering of evidence, the resident knew that the fight with the HOA was far from over. The letters kept coming, each one more formal and threatening than the last. The fines mentioned were small in amount, but the tone of the communications was intimidating, hinting at the possibility of escalating legal action. Despite this, the resident refused to respond with anger or rashness. They understood that maintaining a calm and methodical approach would be more effective than reacting emotionally. The first step was to schedule a meeting with the HOA representatives. The resident hoped that a face-to-face discussion could clarify misunderstandings and perhaps resolve the matter without further conflict. When the day of the meeting arrived, the HOA arrived early, documents in hand, ready to present facts calmly and clearly. They noticed the room was filled with HOA members, some of whom seemed impatient as if they had already made up their minds. Others looked curious, glancing at the piles of papers the resident had brought along. The atmosphere was tense, but the resident remained composed, understanding that composure would be a powerful tool. The meeting began with standard introductions, followed by the resident laying out the history of the property, the parking lot, and the lake. They presented copies of deeds, maps, and photographs that traced the boundaries over the years. They explained how the lake and parking lot had been used historically by residents, showing that there was no reason to believe the HOA had any legitimate claim. The presentation was calm, methodical, and thorough. Each piece of evidence was carefully explained, leaving little room for misunderstanding. The HOA representatives listened, but their responses were dismissive. They repeated the same points from their letters, claiming authority over the areas and insisting that no use should occur without their approval. They mentioned rules and regulations that seemed tangential or irrelevant, but the resident patiently addressed each one, showing documentation that contradicted their assertions. The room grew quiet at times as the resident presented clear, factual evidence. Even some of the skeptical HOA members seemed to pause, forced to consider the points being made. After several hours of discussion, the meeting ended without a clear resolution. The HOA still maintained their stance, but it was clear to the resident that their persistence had made an impact. They had demonstrated knowledge, preparation, and calm determination. The next steps were crucial. The resident began to strategize, planning how to continue gathering support and reinforcing their position. They knew that documentation alone might not be enough. Community support could play a critical role in countering the HOA's authority. Neighbors started noticing the ongoing tension. Some approached the resident privately, expressing admiration and support. They shared stories of their own experiences with the HOA, highlighting minor grievances and rules that had always seemed excessive. Slowly, a quiet network of support began to form. People who had felt powerless found hope in seeing someone stand up with such calm determination. It became clear that the residents' fight was inspiring others to pay attention, to question authority, and to consider fairness over blind compliance. As the days turned into weeks, the HOA began to escalate their tactics. Notices became more frequent, some arriving almost daily. They sent letters that outlined fines, potential legal action, and even warnings about involving local authorities if the resident did not comply. Despite the growing pressure, the resident refused to be intimidated. They carefully cataloged each communication, noting dates, times, and specific threats. Each piece of documentation added to their growing arsenal of evidence, reinforcing their position and preparing them for any eventual legal proceedings. The lake remained a central point in the dispute. Its calm waters had always been a sanctuary, a place to think and reflect, and now it symbolized the struggle for fairness and justice. Walking along its edge, the resident often considered the history embedded in every ripple and reflection. They remembered past picnics, quiet afternoons with friends, and the peaceful mornings when the sun reflected off the water. This connection to the land fueled their determination. It wasn't just property, it was a part of life, a part of the community, and a part of history. The parking lot also took on new significance. Once a mundane space, it had become a symbol of the right to use what was theirs. The resident thought about how many times neighbors had relied on that space, how visitors had parked there without incident, and how the HOA's sudden claim disrupted not only their life, but also the routine of everyone who used the lot. This realization strengthened their resolve. The fight was about more than personal convenience. It was about standing up against unnecessary control and protecting communal freedom. The resident also sought professional advice. They consulted with property experts and legal advisors who specialized in property rights and HOA disputes. Each consultation reinforced their understanding that the evidence was on their side. They were advised to continue documenting every interaction, maintain a calm demeanor, and avoid any confrontational behavior that could be used against them. This guidance reinforced their strategy: patience, precision, and preparation. Meanwhile, tensions in the neighborhood grew. Some residents avoided the subject, wary of taking sides and attracting the HOA's attention. Others quietly expressed support, offering historical photographs, personal accounts, and anecdotes that corroborated the residents' claim. The quiet network of support became a subtle yet powerful force. The resident began to see that their fight was not isolated. It resonated with others who had long felt the HOA's heavy-handed control. Community solidarity, even in small ways, began to tip the balance, creating a sense of shared purpose. Despite the stress and pressure, the resident remained grounded. Mornings were spent reviewing documents, afternoons walking by the lake to clear their mind, and evenings spent strategizing the next steps. Friends and family provided moral support, encouraging them to stay calm and focused. Each day reinforced a simple truth: persistence, preparation, and clarity of purpose could withstand even the most intimidating opposition. The HOA, sensing that the resident was not yielding, tried to assert authority in other ways. They posted notices in common areas, reminding residents of rules and regulations and subtly referencing the ongoing dispute. Some residents began to worry about potential repercussions, but many quietly supported the resident, recognizing the injustice in the HOA's actions. The community's perception began to shift. Where once the HOA held unquestioned power, the residents' steadfast approach inspired others to consider fairness, evidence, and common sense. Over time, the resident began to document the everyday impact of the dispute. They recorded instances where access to the parking lot or lake was challenged, noting how these actions affected not only themselves, but also neighbors, visitors, and community routines. This record served a dual purpose. It reinforced their legal position and provided a narrative of fairness and community impact. The story was no longer just about property. It was about the broader implications of control, authority, and respect within a neighborhood. At this stage, the resident realized that the fight would likely be long and complex. They understood that legal action might become necessary if the HOA refused to back down. However, they were not motivated by conflict. They were motivated by principle. Every action was measured, every communication carefully considered. The focus was on truth, fairness, and evidence rather than retaliation or personal gain. This approach, rooted in calm determination, slowly began to earn respect even from those who had initially been skeptical. As the days and weeks passed, the resident noticed a subtle change in the HOA's behavior. Their letters, while still formal, seemed less aggressive. Meetings were scheduled rather than imposed, and there were occasional pauses in communication. While the HOA had not conceded anything, the resident recognized that persistence, evidence, and calm resistance were beginning to have an effect. The struggle was far from over, but momentum was slowly shifting. In the quiet moments by the lake, the resident reflected on the journey so far. They considered the importance of standing up for what was right, even when faced with intimidating authority. They thought about the community that had quietly rallied behind them, the neighbors who had shared memories, photographs, and support. The lake, once a simple source of peace, had become a symbol of resilience, history, and the quiet power of persistence. The parking lot, mundane in its original purpose, now symbolized the right to access, freedom, and fairness. This second stage of the conflict set the foundation for the challenges ahead. The resident had established a clear position, built a network of support, and maintained a calm and methodical approach. They had proven that even in the face of intimidation and bureaucracy, truth and persistence could prevail. The story was no longer just about a property dispute. It was about principle, fairness, and the courage to stand up for what was right. The battle with the HOA had entered a new phase, one that required strategy, patience, and unwavering commitment to justice. The resident knew the journey was far from over, but they were ready for whatever came next, confident that calm persistence and careful preparation would guide them through. As the conflict with the homeowners association grew more intense, the resident knew that patience and careful planning were more important than ever. The HOA had begun taking more aggressive measures, posting signs near the parking lot and lake, claiming that access was restricted without their approval. The signs were official-looking and intimidating, but the resident refused to be swayed by their appearance. They understood that authority alone did not determine truth or ownership. History, records, and evidence mattered far more than intimidation tactics. The resident decided to document every single interaction meticulously. They took photographs of the signs, noting the dates and locations, and kept detailed logs of any verbal encounters with HOA members. Every letter and email from the association was cataloged, and they responded to each communication calmly and professionally. There was no yelling, no threats, no rash decisions, just careful, methodical documentation that would serve as a solid foundation if legal action became necessary. Word of the dispute began to spread through the neighborhood. Some residents approached the resident privately, expressing frustration with the HOA and offering support. They shared stories of similar experiences where rules had been enforced inconsistently or unfairly. The resident listened attentively, taking notes and collecting historical evidence from neighbors. Old photographs, maps, and personal recollections became crucial pieces of the puzzle, reinforcing the residents' claim that the parking lot and lake had always been theirs. Despite the growing support, the HOA continued to escalate the situation. They sent letters threatening fines, penalties, and even legal action if the resident did not comply with their demands. Some letters hinted at towing vehicles from the parking lot and restricting access to the lake. The resident remained calm. They knew that emotional reactions could be used against them, and they were determined to maintain composure. Instead, they focused on gathering evidence, understanding their rights, and building a case that could not be ignored. The resident also sought professional advice. They consulted with property experts and legal advisors who specialized in HOA disputes. These professionals confirmed that the residents' documentation and historical records strongly supported their ownership of both the parking lot and the lake. They were advised to continue documenting interactions, maintain a calm demeanor, and avoid any confrontational behavior that could weaken their position. This advice reinforced the residents' approach and gave them confidence that they were on the right path. The lake became a central focus during this period. It was not just a body of water. It represented freedom, history, and the right to enjoy one's property. The residents spent time walking along its edge, reflecting on the countless afternoons spent there, the picnics, the quiet mornings, and the moments of peace it had provided. Each ripple in the water reminded them of why they were fighting, not out of anger, but to protect something that had long been a part of their life and the community's history. The parking lot, once an ordinary space, now held new significance. It represented access, convenience, and the right to use property without fear of arbitrary restrictions. The resident remembered helping neighbors with car troubles, organizing community gatherings, and watching friends and family enjoy the space without incident. The HOA's attempts to claim control over it seemed increasingly unreasonable, but the resident remained focused on their strategy, knowing that persistence and preparation were key. Neighbors began to notice the residents' dedication and calm persistence. Some offered additional support, providing historical documents and personal accounts that corroborated the residents' claim. Others who had been neutral or hesitant started to take notice, seeing the fairness and reason in the residents' approach. The quiet support network grew stronger, and the resident realized that the fight was not just about property. It was about principles, fairness, and standing up against unnecessary authority. The residents' days were filled with careful preparation. Mornings were spent reviewing documents and planning next steps. Afternoons were often spent walking by the lake, reflecting and staying grounded. Evenings were dedicated to organizing evidence, responding to correspondence, and strategizing for future interactions with the HOA. The routine was demanding, but it reinforced the residents' resolve and clarity of purpose. Every action was deliberate, and every decision was guided by a commitment to fairness and truth. The HOA, sensing that their intimidation tactics were not working, tried to involve local authorities. They suggested that the residents' use of the parking lot and lake without approval could be considered trespassing or violation of HOA rules. The resident remained calm and documented every interaction with authorities, ensuring that there was a clear record of the situation. They continued to rely on historical evidence, property maps, and legal guidance to reinforce their position, knowing that a well-prepared and documented approach was more powerful than confrontation or emotion. As the struggle continued, the resident began to see subtle shifts in the neighborhood's perception. More residents quietly expressed support, sharing their own experiences and acknowledging the fairness of the residents' position. The HOA's attempts to enforce strict control were increasingly met with skepticism and quiet resistance. The residents' methodical and calm approach was inspiring others to question arbitrary authority and consider the importance of fairness and evidence. During this period, the resident also focused on building a narrative that could be shared if the situation escalated publicly. They documented not just the property dispute, but the broader impact on the community. Instances where neighbors were affected by restricted access, stories of historical use of the lake and parking lot, and evidence of the HOA's inconsistent enforcement of rules were all carefully recorded. This narrative would later serve as a powerful tool to illustrate the fairness of the residents' position and the broader significance of the conflict. Despite the growing tension, the resident found moments of peace and clarity by the lake. Walking along the water's edge, they reflected on the importance of standing up for what was right. They considered the history embedded in the landscape, the memories of community gatherings, and the quiet beauty of the surroundings. These moments reinforced their determination and reminded them that the fight was not about personal gain or recognition, but about protecting something valuable and meaningful. The parking lot, too, continued to serve as a reminder of practical necessity and community access. The resident thought about the convenience it provided, the times neighbors relied on it, and the fairness of maintaining open access. The HOA's efforts to control it seemed increasingly unreasonable, and the residents' resolve to protect it grew stronger with each passing day. They knew that maintaining calm, documenting every interaction, and relying on evidence were the keys to success. Throughout this stage of the conflict, the resident remained focused on strategy and preparation. They knew that the HOA would continue to apply pressure, but they were determined to respond with patience, clarity, and evidence-based arguments. Every letter, every photograph, and every recorded interaction added to the growing body of proof that supported their claim. The resident understood that persistence, preparation, and calm determination were more powerful than confrontation or emotion. As the weeks passed, the resident noticed a subtle change in the HOA's behavior. While they continued to issue notices and enforce rules, their attempts to intimidate were less effective. The growing community support, combined with the residents' calm and methodical approach, made it clear that their position was strong. The dispute was far from over, but momentum was slowly shifting in favor of the resident. In quiet moments by the lake, the resident reflected on the journey so far. They considered the importance of standing up for fairness even in the face of intimidation. They thought about the neighbors who had quietly supported them, the historical evidence that reinforced their claim, and the broader message of justice and principle that their actions conveyed. The lake, once a simple place of peace, had become a symbol of resilience, history, and the quiet power of persistence. The parking lot, once mundane, now symbolized access, fairness, and the right to use what was rightfully theirs. This stage of the conflict established a foundation for the challenges ahead. The resident had proven that calm persistence, careful documentation, and community support could counter even the most aggressive intimidation tactics. They had built a strong case based on evidence, history, and principle. The fight was no longer just about property, it was about fairness, community, and standing up for what is right. The resident knew that the next phase would require continued patience, careful planning, and unwavering commitment to justice, but they were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The struggle with the Homeowners Association had reached a point where it was no longer just a personal battle. The resident realized that the dispute had started to affect the entire neighborhood. Conversations between neighbors were filled with whispers of frustration, concern, and curiosity. People who had been indifferent or fearful of the HOA began to take notice of the residents' persistence and calm determination. Slowly, the quiet support network that had formed around the resident grew stronger and more visible. The HOA, sensing that their tactics of intimidation were losing effectiveness, tried new strategies. They sent more formal letters citing rules and regulations that were either outdated or inconsistently enforced. They even attempted to involve local authorities, suggesting that the residents' use of the parking lot and lake could be seen as unauthorized. Yet the resident remained composed. Every letter was documented, every communication recorded, and every encounter with officials noted in a detailed log. The residents' meticulous approach ensured that no detail could be overlooked or misrepresented in the future. Community support became a vital part of the strategy. Neighbors who had quietly observed the dispute began sharing their own experiences with the HOA. Some provided historical photographs, old maps, and personal accounts of how the lake and parking lot had always been part of the residents' property. These contributions were invaluable. They reinforced the residents' case and also highlighted a broader pattern of overreach by the HOA. The resident began compiling this evidence, creating a thorough record that not only supported their claim, but also illustrated the wider implications of the HOA's actions. The resident continued to maintain a calm and methodical routine. Mornings were dedicated to reviewing documents, planning the day's actions, and strategizing for upcoming interactions with the HOA. Afternoons were often spent walking along the lake, reflecting on the history of the land and the importance of standing up for fairness. Evenings were used to organize evidence, draft professional correspondence, and document any new developments. This structured approach allowed the resident to remain focused, clear-headed, and prepared for whatever challenges might arise. The lake itself remained a symbol of resilience and perseverance. Its calm waters provided a sense of peace even amidst the ongoing conflict. The resident often walked along its edge, considering the countless memories associated with it, the quiet mornings, the afternoon picnics, and the laughter of children who had grown up enjoying the water. This connection to the land reinforced the residents' determination. The fight was not about personal gain, but about protecting a space that held significant meaning for themselves and the community. Similarly, the parking lot, once a routine part of daily life, had taken on new significance. It represented access, convenience, and the right to use property without unnecessary restriction. The resident thought about the countless times neighbors had relied on the lot, whether for routine parking, social gatherings, or community events. The HOA's attempts to control the space were increasingly seen as unreasonable, and the residents' determination to defend it grew stronger. Every act of calm resistance reinforced the principle that fairness and evidence mattered more than authority or intimidation. As the resident continued to document interactions and gather evidence, they also began to consider the possibility of public exposure. The dispute was no longer just a personal matter. It had implications for the broader community. If handled thoughtfully, sharing the story could highlight issues of fairness, property rights, and the importance of standing up against unnecessary control. The resident began compiling a narrative that combined historical evidence, personal accounts, and the broader impact of the HOA's actions on neighbors. This narrative would serve as a powerful tool if the conflict escalated further. The HOA, meanwhile, continued to underestimate the residents' resolve. They posted signs, sent more letters, and attempted to involve authorities, but each attempt was met with calm, precise responses. The resident documented every step, ensuring that there was a clear chronological record of events. This approach not only strengthened the legal position, but also demonstrated to neighbors and potential supporters that the resident was organized, reasonable, and committed to fairness. Community members began to take subtle actions of their own. Some started leaving letters of support, historical documents, or photographs in a secure place with the resident. Others shared their stories during neighborhood gatherings, highlighting instances where the HOA's rules had been inconsistently enforced. The quiet solidarity created a sense of collective purpose. The resident realized that they were not fighting alone. The community was beginning to stand together, guided by fairness, evidence, and principle. The resident also remained focused on personal composure. Despite the stress and the constant pressure from the HOA, they maintained a routine that balanced preparation with reflection. Walking by the lake became a form of meditation, a time to consider the history of the land, the memories attached to it, and the broader lessons of fairness and persistence. Each ripple in the water was a reminder that calm, consistent effort could withstand even the most aggressive challenges. The parking lot continued to be a practical symbol of the conflict. The resident thought about neighbors who relied on the space for everyday convenience and community activities. By maintaining access and documenting every interaction, the resident reinforced the principle that fairness and rightful ownership mattered more than the arbitrary exercise of power. The fight was about more than property. It was about community, justice, and the quiet assertion of principle over intimidation. During this phase, the resident began to see the subtle impact of their efforts on the HOA's behavior. While the association continued to send letters and attempt enforcement, their tactics became less aggressive and more procedural. The calm, methodical resistance, combined with growing community awareness and support, was beginning to shift the balance. The resident recognized that persistence, evidence, and composure were slowly changing the dynamics of the dispute. In quiet moments, the resident reflected on the journey so far. They considered the importance of standing up for what was right, even when faced with bureaucratic intimidation. They thought about the neighbors who had offered support, the historical evidence that reinforced their claim, and the broader message of fairness and principle that their actions conveyed. The lake, once a simple retreat, had become a symbol of resilience and quiet power. The parking lot, mundane in its original purpose, now symbolized access, fairness, and the right to use what was rightfully theirs. The resident also began to anticipate the next phase of the conflict. They knew that the HOA might escalate further, possibly through legal channels or additional enforcement measures. However, they were prepared. Every document, photograph, and personal account had been carefully organized. Every interaction had been documented with precision. The resident understood that preparation, patience, and clarity of purpose were the most powerful tools in facing the challenges ahead. Community support continued to strengthen. Neighbors who had once been silent began to speak more openly, sharing their experiences and validating the residents' claims. The quiet network of support became a visible force, illustrating that the fight was not just about property but about fairness, justice, and standing up against unnecessary authority. The resident realized that their calm persistence had inspired others, creating a ripple effect that extended beyond their own situation. Throughout this phase, the resident maintained a balanced routine. Mornings were spent reviewing evidence, planning strategy, and responding to correspondence. Afternoons were often spent walking by the lake, reflecting on the history and significance of the land. Evenings were dedicated to organizing documents, preparing responses, and maintaining a clear record of all interactions. This structured approach allowed the resident to remain focused, clear-headed, and prepared for whatever challenges might arise. The HOA, despite their efforts, was increasingly constrained by the residents' preparation and community support. Attempts to intimidate or enforce control were met with calm, documented responses. The residents' methodical approach left little room for misrepresentation or unfair advantage. Each letter, photograph, and recorded interaction strengthened the residents' position and reinforced the principle that fairness and evidence mattered more than authority alone. In moments of quiet reflection, the resident considered the broader lessons of the conflict. They thought about the importance of standing up for what was right, the power of persistence, and the value of community support. The lake, with its calm waters and enduring presence, served as a constant reminder that patience and perseverance could withstand challenges. The parking lot, once ordinary, now symbolized access, fairness, and the right to use property without arbitrary restriction. This stage of the conflict had solidified the residents' position and prepared them for the challenges ahead. They had built a strong foundation based on evidence, community support, and calm persistence. The fight was no longer just about property. It was about fairness, justice, and the courage to stand up against unnecessary authority. The resident knew that the next phase would require continued patience, careful planning, and unwavering commitment, but they were ready to face whatever came next, confident that their approach would guide them to a just resolution. The weeks and months of careful preparation, calm persistence, and strategic action had brought the resident to the final stage of the dispute with the homeowners association. By now, the neighborhood was fully aware of the conflict, and the resident had garnered quiet but solid support from many of the community members. The lake and parking lot were no longer just personal spaces. They had become symbols of fairness, justice, and the power of standing up against intimidation. The HOA, realizing that their attempts to intimidate and control the situation were failing, began to change tactics. They reduced aggressive communications and seemed more willing to consider the evidence presented. Yet the resident knew better than to assume victory prematurely. They continued to maintain detailed records of every letter, every email, every conversation, and every encounter related to the dispute. Every photograph of the lake, every historical document about the parking lot, every neighbor's testimony was carefully preserved. This thorough preparation ensured the resident's case was strong, irrefutable, and well organized. Legal consultations had become an essential part of the process. The resident met with property experts, attorneys, and advisors who reviewed all documentation and offered guidance on next steps. They were advised to remain patient, continue documenting all interactions, and approach any formal proceedings calmly and methodically. The advice reinforced the residents' strategy. Persistence, clarity, and evidence-based action were the keys to success. The resident followed this guidance with dedication, knowing that patience would ultimately yield results. Neighbors continued to play a vital role in the unfolding story. Many came forward to provide historical photographs, maps, and personal accounts that reinforced the residents' claim. Some shared memories of community events held at the lake and parking lot, while others provided documentation of past property boundaries and usage. This collective effort strengthened the residents' position and highlighted the unfairness of the HOA's claims. It became clear that the dispute was no longer just an individual matter. It was a reflection of the community's shared values and history. Despite the ongoing conflict, the resident found moments of calm and clarity by the lake. They walked along its edge, reflecting on the journey so far. The gentle lapping of the water, the rustling of leaves, and the quiet presence of wildlife offered a sense of peace amidst the tension. The lake symbolized not just personal enjoyment, but also resilience, patience, and the enduring power of standing up for what is right. These quiet moments reinforced the residents' determination and reminded them of the broader significance of the fight. The parking lot, too, remained a central focus. Once an ordinary part of daily life, it had become a symbol of access, fairness, and the right to use property without unnecessary restrictions. The resident thought about the times neighbors had relied on it, the convenience it provided, and the way it supported community activities. Maintaining control over the parking lot was as much about principle as it was about practicality. Each successful action in defending its use reinforced the residents' confidence and resolve. As the legal and administrative processes unfolded, the HOA's resistance began to wane. Their letters became less frequent and less threatening. Some members of the association even began to acknowledge the strength of the residents' evidence and the support of the community. This shift was subtle but significant. The resident recognized that years of calm, methodical effort and unwavering commitment to principle were beginning to pay off. Every documented interaction, every photograph, every historical account contributed to a growing recognition of fairness and rightful ownership. Throughout this period, the resident maintained a structured routine. Mornings were devoted to reviewing evidence, responding to any communication, and planning strategy. Afternoons were spent walking by the lake, reflecting on the history of the land and the broader implications of the dispute. Evenings were dedicated to organizing documents, drafting professional correspondence, and preparing for potential formal proceedings. This disciplined approach ensured that the resident remained focused, composed, and ready for any challenges that might arise. The community's response continued to strengthen the residents' position. Neighbors who had initially been hesitant or indifferent began to offer support more openly. They shared stories of past experiences with the HOA, validated the residents' claims, and highlighted instances where rules had been applied inconsistently or unfairly. This collective support not only reinforced the residents' case but also demonstrated to the HOA that their authority could not be exercised without accountability. The neighborhood had become a quiet but powerful ally in the struggle for fairness. The final steps of the process involved formal review and verification of property records. Legal experts and property professionals confirmed that the parking lot and lake were indeed part of the residents' property, and that the HOA's claims were without merit. These confirmations were meticulously documented and added to the growing body of evidence. The resident felt a sense of satisfaction, not from a desire to dominate or punish, but from the knowledge that truth, fairness, and preparation had prevailed over intimidation and overreach. With the evidence firmly established, the HOA was compelled to acknowledge the residents' rightful ownership. Formal communications confirmed that the parking lot and lake were indeed the residents' property, and that no restrictions could be imposed by the association. Any previous threats, fines, or notices were effectively nullified. The resolution was not just a personal victory, but a validation of careful planning, calm persistence, and the power of standing up for what is right. The neighborhood watched as the resident calmly resumed normal life. The lake shimmered under the sunlight, and the parking lot remained accessible for those who had always had the right to use it. The community's quiet support and the residents' methodical approach had ensured that fairness and justice were upheld. Neighbors felt reassured that the HOA could not impose unreasonable authority without accountability. The resolution served as a lesson in the importance of evidence, principle, and collective awareness. The resident reflected on the journey with a sense of quiet satisfaction. They considered the importance of remaining calm under pressure, of documenting every detail, and of building support through reason and evidence. The lake and parking lot, once points of conflict, now stood as symbols of resilience, fairness, and the enduring value of standing up for what is right. The residents' actions had not only protected personal property, but it also strengthened the community and set a precedent for fairness and accountability. In the days following the resolution, life gradually returned to a sense of normalcy. The resident continued to enjoy peaceful walks by the lake, and neighbors resumed using the parking lot without concern. The quiet triumph reinforced the idea that patience, preparation, and a commitment to fairness could overcome even the most persistent attempts at intimidation. The community had witnessed a clear example of principled action and the power of calm, methodical resistance. The story of the dispute spread quietly through the neighborhood, serving as a reminder of the importance of standing up for one's rights. Neighbors discussed the events in casual conversations, sharing observations and reflecting on the lessons learned. The residents' calm persistence had inspired others to consider the value of fairness, preparation, and principled action. The lake and parking lot became more than just physical spaces. They were symbols of integrity, resilience, and community spirit. The resident understood that the journey had been about more than winning a property dispute. It had been about demonstrating that calm, thoughtful action, supported by evidence and principle, could overcome intimidation and arbitrary authority. The HOA's attempts to control and restrict had ultimately failed, not through aggression or confrontation, but through persistence, preparation, and the quiet power of reasoned action. As the months passed, the resident continued to maintain a sense of balance and reflection. Walks by the lake remained a source of peace and inspiration. Observing the water, listening to the subtle sounds of nature, and reflecting on the journey reinforced the lessons learned about fairness, patience, and community support. The parking lot continued to serve its practical purpose, but also remained a symbol of rightful ownership and access. The community, reassured by the resolution, moved forward with a renewed sense of awareness about the importance of fairness and accountability. The resolution also strengthened the residents' relationships within the neighborhood. Neighbors who had supported and validated the effort felt a sense of pride in their collective action. The quiet solidarity that had grown during the conflict continued to influence community interactions, fostering a stronger sense of fairness and mutual respect. The lake and parking lot, once sources of tension, became shared symbols of resilience, principle, and community values. In reflection, the resident recognized the broader significance of the experience. Standing up to the HOA had required patience, careful preparation, community engagement, and unwavering commitment to principle. The outcome demonstrated that truth, fairness, and reasoned action could overcome intimidation and overreach. The lake and parking lot, once points of contention, now represented the enduring power of persistence, calm, and justice. The story concluded with a sense of quiet triumph. The resident had successfully defended what was rightfully theirs, strengthened community awareness, and demonstrated the value of principled action. The HOA, having acknowledged the rightful ownership, retreated from attempts to assert control. The neighborhood returned to a sense of normalcy, but the lessons remained clear. Fairness, preparation, and community support could overcome even the most persistent challenges. The residents' calm, methodical, and human-centric approach